So in this video, I'm going to add some drawers to the bottom of the workbench that I've been building for the last few months. The unofficial theme of this workbench has been using reused, scavenged, or cheap materials, and the drawers are going to be no different. I'm using CDX plywood, which I bought for a little over $36 a sheet. CDX plywood is intended as sheathing for the outside of buildings or underneath roofs, and it is garbage to work with. The camera doesn't even really do justice as to how bad the surface of this plywood is. Despite my desire to use cheap materials, I still wanted these drawers to look good and be solid and feel nice to use, so I decided to see how much effort it was going to take to make this cheap plywood do that. I started by breaking down the large sheets with a track saw. 5 pieces of the plywood will make up the drawer box. The 2 top and bottom pieces are pretty big, so I completed those with the track saw, but I was able to cut the 3 vertical parts on the table saw. I wanted to keep the construction of the box as simple as possible, so instead of cutting dados and rabbets, I decided to make little angled brackets that would go in the corners of all the joints to strengthen them. These were made out of some of the last remaining dimensional lumber scraps that I had from my shop construction. Here's an example of just how bowed this plywood is. I used a piece of scrap to keep it straight while I attached the corner angle. I glued and nailed the corner angle on, but I left that piece of scrap clamped on until the glue had fully dried. This plywood was rough enough that by the time I got to the part of attaching the vertical pieces, I decided I better switch over to construction adhesive instead of wood glue. After nailing this together, I switched over to using a finish nailer since I figured these joints warranted a slightly larger fastener. I had to use clamps and weights just to keep the bottom panel flat while I attached the vertical pieces. I consider it to be somewhat of a miracle that every single one of these joints was square. Most of the pieces of this plywood will not really be visible, but the sides will be, so I wanted to get those sanded and as smooth as possible. Even after going over with 80 grit, you can really see here just how cracked, dented, and gouged this stuff is. Of course, this would be fine if it was underneath shingles or siding as it's intended to be used, but this is not really how I want my workbench to look. So enter the body filler. The sides got 2 thorough applications and sandings of the body filler, but this stuff was used all over the project. I cut some thin strips of solid wood to use to attach to the drawer box to cover up the raw exposed plywood edges. This was glued and pin nailed on, and though I don't show it, I used a sander to get the edges all flush. And of course some more body filler to fill nail holes, gaps, and edges that were rough looking. Once it was all sanded and reasonably smooth, I applied 2 coats of primer. The primer was followed by 2 coats of black paint, and I actually managed to get the side panels to look pretty nice. While the paint was curing on the drawer box, I turned my attention to making the drawers themselves. Most of the pieces of the drawers are made out of the remaining CDX plywood that I had bought, but there are a few parts you'll see in the shots that are made out of solid wood, and that was just because I had run out of the plywood and I didn't want to buy any more of this crap. I ran all the parts through the drum sander just to try and get them as smooth as possible before I continued with the drawer construction. Since the interior parts of the drawers aren't really going to be visible unless the drawer is open, I didn't go too crazy on this like I did with the side panels on the drawer box. I mainly wanted to get these pieces of wood down to the point where you didn't get splinters just from looking at them sideways. I cut rabbets in the side pieces for the joinery. As you'll see over the next couple of minutes, this was an unnecessary step and I should have just used butt joints. And as an example of just how ill-suited CDX plywood is for this application, look at this giant void in the middle of one of my rabbets. But I guess that's not something we can't fix with a little more body filler. I assembled the drawer boxes with more construction adhesive and nails, and there's not a lot of footage of this because something went weird with the camera where it suddenly switched over to slow motion. Even sped up to 600%, there was really no point in trying to use this footage. After the drawer boxes themselves were complete, I added these cleats all the way around the perimeter so there'd be something to attach the drawer bottoms to. Next, each drawer got 2 coats of water-based polyurethane, and this was really just to stabilize everything and keep splinters from forming around the edges. This is complete overkill for drawer bottoms, but I had a couple sheets of OSB left over from the shop build as well. There's not a lot of things outside of construction that I'd want to use OSB for, but it helped keep the price of this project down. I covered the OSB with toolbox liners so the inside of the drawers would have a little bit of padding at the bottom and it would look as nice as possible. I used contact cement to attach the material to the OSB. To finish these off, I attached the drawer bottoms with some more construction adhesive. I moved the drawer box over to my main workbench so I could start installing the drawer slides. It's been a little over a month since I finished the main table portion of this workbench, and I love having a height adjustable table this size. What I don't love is realizing that I screwed up the size on all 8 of those drawers. So as it turns out, I am a dumbass, and as rough as this build already is, it's going to get rougher because I did a bad job of measuring, and these drawers need to be exactly 1 inch narrower than the opening to make room for the drawer slides, but in my haste, I made them the exact same width as the opening, so there's no room for the drawer slides, which means I need to remove 1 inch from the end of this drawer. And unfortunately, it's all glued and nailed together. So I've already modified these 2 to fit, and I'm going to show you. They're really half-assed, but I think structurally sound enough way that I'm going to modify the rest of them. So I settled on just sawing 1 inch off of these things. So I am cutting through all the 18 gauge brad nails that I used, so I put the old stock blade back onto the saw. I didn't want to try to recreate those rabbets with all the nails that I would have to cut through, so I just removed the excess and then I reattached the side of the drawer with butt joints. I attached a new piece to support that side of the drawer bottom. After that, the entire piece was both glued and nailed back onto the drawer. This isn't pretty, but the drawers really weren't pretty to start with. So that took about 10 minutes, but now my drawer will fit with clearance for the drawer slides on each side. Now that all the drawer boxes were the correct size, I started attaching the slides. I'm using 18-inch full extension side mount drawer slides. I want to say the weight capacity is about 150 pounds. Whatever it is, it's going to be more than what's going to end up in these drawers anyway. I really don't get too fancy when I install side mount drawer slides. I put a line on the side, I line it up in the holes to what looks like center, and then I screw it in. If I need to make any adjustments, I will, but typically I get these right the first time, unlike the width of my drawers. Once all the drawer slides were installed, I moved the drawer box down to the floor and permanently installed it into the bottom of the workbench. When I designed this workbench, I did consider attaching the drawer box to the bottom of the upper part so it would raise up off the ground when I elevated the table, but in the end I opted not to do that. I didn't really want to add a couple hundred pounds to the lifting requirements for the hydraulic cylinders, and I also didn't want to have the drawer behind the vise in a way where I wouldn't be able to open it. Additionally, having the drawer box on the bottom meant I had a little bit more space to store stuff on top of the box itself, since there's a little bit of a gap between it and the top of the table. I used some 2x6s that I resawed and glued together to create panels for the drawer faces. One of the ironies of working with really cheap products like I am on this build is if you want to make it look good, you're probably going to end up needing to have several $1,000s worth of tools to be able to do it. Well, maybe that's an overstatement, but it is accurate to say that it takes more work to make something nice looking out of cheap materials, and it's going to take more work to make cheap materials look nice if you don't have nice tools. Anyway, enough about that. Right now, this resaw is about to illustrate how wood that appears to be straight can be deceptively crooked. Each of these pieces of 2x6 were really straight prior to milling, but when I resawed them, each one came out bowed like this. The cuts released a lot of inner tension in the wood that I was going to have to deal with if I was going to have any kind of flat drawer fronts. I started by slicing each of those pieces in half. When I laid them out for the glue up, I alternated the direction of the bow going up and down. This way the tension in the boards would act against each other, so the entire piece would end up being flat. I used clamping cauls to keep every piece as coplanar as possible while the glue set. I also left these in the clamps for a good 12 to 18 hours because the shop heat pump hasn't been installed yet and the temperature was pretty low. Out of the clamps, each panel was pretty flat, but they still needed to be ran through the planer. Because of my efforts in milling and gluing these together, I was able to keep each drawer face 5/8 of an inch thick, so I really had minimal material loss. I know I just mentioned something about material loss, but the reason I'm removing so much right now is because I made these panels oversized to compensate for planar snipe. All those offcuts will be saved for firewood. Since my last video, I added T-tracks to the top of the work surface, and here you can see the reasoning behind the dog holes on the twin screw vise. That MDF stop was just a temporary solution. Since I filmed this, I made an adjustable one that's much more versatile. Since these are just shop drawers, I wasn't too concerned about having little 23 gauge pinholes in the drawer faces. I used the pin nails to get the drawer faces temporarily installed, and then I reinforced everything with screws from the back. The drawer faces themselves got 3 coats of water-based polyurethane. Lastly, I installed the drawer handles, which would give a little bit more support to holding the drawer faces on from the center. I may make a few modifications or add-ons in the future, but for now, I'm calling this workbench 100% done. And since I filmed that, the last heat pump was installed, so now the shop is 100% done. So far, I love this new workbench, and I'm really looking forward to all the projects I'm going to be able to make using it. And I love that it's made from about 70% recycled materials from the shop build. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and if you made it this far, thanks for watching.